three ancient wise men, each holding a key to Freemasonry's past. But who among them truly opened the door to combine philosophy with stonemasonry? Was it Pythagoras with his mystical numbers, Euclid with his perfect lines, or Socrates with his probing questions? Well, in this edition of Daily Masonic Progress, we will unlock the secrets of these great thinkers and see how their philosophies shaped Masonic ideals. And by the end, you'll discover why one of them stands out, in my opinion, as the philosophical father of our craft. But first, we need to understand Freemasonry's history. You see, as we know it today, it focuses on moral and spiritual growth, but it didn't appear out of thin air. The craft traces its history back to King Solomon's temple and even earlier. We know it formally grew from the humble roots of the working stonemasons guild, and these craftsmen who built the great cathedrals and castles of Europe formed tight-knit groups to protect their trade secrets and support each other. And over time, educated men joined these guilds, bringing ideas from ancient wisdom and philosophy. They blended these concepts with the symbols and structure of the stonemason's craft. And this created the rich symbolism and philosophical teachings that we see in Freemasonry today. Our earliest written records, the Regis poem from around 1390 and the Matthew Cook manuscript of 1450, reflect this blend. They tell a grand story of Masonry's origins, linking it to biblical times and great thinkers. The official birth of modern Freemasonry came in 1717 with the formation of the first Grand Lodge in London. But this event didn't create Freemasonry's philosophical core. It simply organised what had been brewing for centuries. And while our history traces our origins back and prior to the building of King Solomon's temple, that history doesn't necessarily account for when philosophy was incorporated into our Masonic teachings. And as we've just seen, Freemasonry has evolved from a practical craft to a philosophical pursuit. And this transformation echoes the journey of our first candidate as the philosophical first Freemason, a man who saw profound truths in the simplest shapes and numbers. So imagine a world where numbers aren't just for counting, but hold the secrets to the universe. This was the world of Pythagoras. Born on the Greek island of Samos around 570 BC, Pythagoras was more than just a geometry whiz that you might remember from school. He was a philosopher, a mystic, and a founder of a society that bears a striking resemblance to our Masonic lodges. Pythagoras travelled widely, studying with the priests in Egypt, the wise men in Babylon. He soaked up knowledge like a sponge and blended mathematics and philosophy and spirituality into a unique worldview. And then after return to Greece, he founded a school in Croton, which is now southern Italy. And that was part academy, part monastery, and part secret society. His school featured degrees of initiation, mirroring our apprentice, fellowcraft, master mason levels. Secrecy and symbolism were paramount, with followers swearing vows and using symbols to convey complex ideas, practice that is familiar to every mason. Pythagoras' belief in sacred geometry, particularly the divine truths he saw in numbers and shapes like the tetraces, resonates with Masonic symbolism. His concept of universal harmony based upon mathematical principles echoes our emphasis on balance and proportion. And moreover, Pythagoras stressed that virtuous living, self-discipline, and continuous learning, values that are at the core of Masonic teachings. And lastly, the communal lifestyle of his followers, sharing both material goods and knowledge, closely aligns with our ideals of brotherhood and mutual support. It's through these striking parallels that we can suggest that Pythagorean thought may have laid a philosophical foundation for what would later become key aspects of Freemasonry. But do you remember the 47th proposition of Euclid? Well, that's Pythagorean theorem, and arguably Pythagoras' most famous contribution to mathematics. But does this make Pythagoras the philosophical first Freemason? Well, he certainly laid the groundwork that deeply resonates with the craft. His blend of practical knowledge and spiritual wisdom, his use of symbols and degrees of initiation, and an emphasis on moral living and brotherly love all feel very Masonic. However, it's important to note that Pythagoras wasn't a stonemason himself. His connection to our craft is more in spirit than in practice. He gave us the philosophical and symbolic tools, but not the craft of Masonry itself. In Pythagoras, we see the seeds of what would become speculative Masonry. He shows us how ancient wisdom can be encoded in numbers and shapes, waiting for future generations to unlock their secrets. And while Pythagoras laid this groundwork for sacred geometry and Masonic thought, it was another ancient thinker who would codify these principles into a system that still influences Masonry today. Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here. This phrase is said to be inscribed above the entrance to Plato's Academy, could just as easily hang over the door of any Masonic lodge. It speaks to the profound influence of Euclid, the father of geometry, on Masonic thought and symbolism. Living in Alexandria around 300 BC, Euclid compiled and systematized the mathematical knowledge of his time in his monumental work, Elements. And this just wasn't your everyday math textbook. It was a blueprint for logical thinking that would shape Western thought for millennia. This connection beautifully links Pythagoras and Euclid in Masonic symbolism. The theorem which states that a right-angled triangle, the square of the hypotenuse, is equal to the sum of squares of the other two sides, holds a place of honor in our ceremonies. But it's not just a mathematical formula for Masons. It represents the balance between our spiritual and material natures. And this proposition demonstrates how Euclid built upon and formalized mathematical insights of Pythagoras. But Euclid's influence on Masonry goes beyond single theorems. His entire approach to geometry, starting with simple definitions and axioms, then building up to complex proof, mirrors the Masonic journey from entered apprentice to master mason. We begin with the basic tools and concepts and gradually constructing a more complete understanding of ourselves and the universe. That our very tools of masonry, the square, the compass, the ruler, they are instruments of Euclidean geometry. We then use them in our rituals, and we're not just remembering the ancient builders, we're connecting to a tradition of seeking truth through reason and measurement, and that goes back to Euclid. But moreover, Euclid's work demonstrates the power of human reason to uncover universal truths. And that's central to Masonry's enlightenment roots, or our ongoing quest for knowledge. And just as Euclid built his geometric proofs step by step, we build our moral and spiritual selves one lesson at a time. It's worth noting that some early Masonic manuscripts, like the Cook manuscript from the 15th century, explicitly mention Euclid as the founder of geometry and link him to the spread of Masonry. While it's more legend than historical fact, it shows how deeply Euclid's ideas have been woven into Masonic law. Euclid's systematic approach to geometry provided Masonry with a solid intellectual foundation. However, the application of these principles to daily life and moral philosophy find its champion in our next candidate. Know thyself. This famous Socratic maxim could well be the cornerstone of Masonic philosophy. But Socrates offers more than just wisdom. He provides a tangible link to the operative roots of Freemasonry. Born in Athens around 470 BC, Socrates stands apart from our previous candidates in a crucial way. He was an actual stonemason. Following in his father's footsteps, Socrates worked with a hammer and a chisel before he wielded his famous method of questioning. And this makes him a true Lewis in Masonic terms, the son of a mason, bridging generations of the craft. But Socrates' approach to philosophy also mirrors the Masonic journey of self-improvement. He believed that wisdom began by acknowledging one's own ignorance, much as we enter the lodge in a state of symbolic darkness. His method of relentless questioning to uncover truth is reflected in our catechisms and the way we encourage Masons to seek further light. Socratic emphasis on virtue and ethical living is also at the heart of Masonic teachings. He taught that knowledge and morality were inseparable, a concept that we reinforce in every degree. His courage in standing by his principles, even in the face of death, embodies the Masonic ideals of fortitude and integrity. And Socrates' life also demonstrates the Masonic principle of meeting on the level, because despite his wisdom, he claimed to know nothing. And he engaged in dialogue with people from all walks of life. And this humility and openness to learning from others is a lesson that every Mason should learn. But Socrates' teachings were not written down by him. They were passed on to his students verbally, and one of particular note is Plato. This oral tradition of transmitting wisdom resonates with Masonic practices of mouth-to-ear instruction and the emphasis on memorization in our rituals. So in Socrates, we find a unique blend of practical craft and philosophical inquiry. He worked with both stone and ideas, shaping not just buildings but minds. His life serves as a bridge between the operative masonry of ancient craftsmen and the speculative masonry we practice today. And with Socrates, that brings us full circle, connecting the intellectual pursuits of Pythagoras and Euclid with the practical craft of stonemasonry. His life and teachings embody the transition from operative to speculative masonry that defines the fraternity we know today. But who then can claim the mantle of being the philosophical first Freemason? Pythagoras with his sacred geometry, Euclid with his systematic proofs, or Socrates with his probing questions? Each has left an incredible mark on Masonic thought, but only one stands out as the embodiment of operative and speculative masonry. All the evidence points compellingly towards Socrates as the philosophical forefather of our craft. Because unlike Pythagoras and Euclid, Socrates wasn't just a philosopher or mathematician. He was an actual stonemason. And this direct link to operative masonry sets him apart. Also, as a Lewis, being the son of a mason, Socrates bridges the generations of craft knowledge, symbolizing the continuity that Freemasonry values. But perhaps most significantly, the one thing that Socrates represents is the very transition from operative to speculative masonry that defines our fraternity. He worked with stone and ideas, crafting not just structures, but shaping minds and souls. And as the father of Western philosophy, Socrates laid the groundwork for intellectual and moral inquiries that are at the heart of Masonic thought. So in Socrates' life and teachings, we then find a compelling model for what it means to be a Mason, ever building, ever striving to shape both the stone and ourself in the pursuit of truth and wisdom.